Any dialogue about immigration obviously has to be grounded in an understanding of time and of place. We all agree about that by now. It certainly requires an understanding of history, and that's why we've got five historians here. As I see it, actually, the task of the humanities scholars on this project is to begin to develop a history that actually can support productive dialogue about immigration today, about immigration here, wherever your particular here and now might be. And that history is not the history of American immigration that many of you learned in school or that many of your museum goers are learning in school today. Have a look, if you want, at current high school history textbooks. Immigration appears twice. It appears first as part of the settlement of the American frontiers of the West in the 19th century, and then a second time, a little bit later, as the story of the transformation of the Northeast into an urban and an industrial society around 1900. And I don't need to tell you, I think, that large numbers of Americans, perhaps even the majority, actually do not see the settlement of the frontier of the West or the urbanization and industrialization of the Northeast as their own story. Very few, especially of your grade school and middle school students, are likely to identify with that history. It's particularly obvious, I think, why African Americans or Native Americans do not see immigration histories like that one as their own histories. But the immigration history we all learned in American public schools is also not the history of Appalachia, for example. My daughter-in-law is from the mountains of Western North Carolina. This is not her history. It is not the history of the people who arrived in the east of North America or the southwest of what is the United States today in the 16th, 17th, or 18th centuries. It's not the history of many Asian or Mexican Americans whose immigration involved experiences of exclusion, fear in crossing borders, or discrimination in crossing borders. And quite frankly, it's not even really the history of many of those European immigrants whose settlement of the West and whose transformation of the Northeast is described in school books. And I'm here to tell you that I cannot recognize my own Italian family's century-long history of moving back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean in those accounts, to give you just one example. Now, I have, let me begin, at least, just begin in a small way in 10 or 15 minutes to develop an alternative history that I believe can support a useful dialogue on today's immigration in the places where we live today. And that history, I would argue, focuses not as much on immigration as it does on movement. 20 years of reading and teaching world history, and I've thrown some titles up there for you, has convinced me that moving, mobility, and movement in many forms, many different patterns, are central to the history of all human beings, not distinctive to the United States or even to other nations of immigrants, but in every time and in every place in human history, we find examples of people moving about. And keeping that ubiquity of movement, that diversity of movement that characterizes the long history of human life on planet Earth helps us to see that Americans in this particular country and elsewhere have always identified only certain types of movement as immigration and only certain people on the move as immigrants. And like Alan, I'm going to take you to Castle Garden. Here's just one example of my point. Until the American Civil War, the most common word used for new arrivals to the United States was emigrant, not immigrant. And if you don't believe me, take a close look. at Castle Garden here in New York Harbor. This is the processing center that, as Alan said, preceded Ellis Island. It was operated by the New York State Commissioner for Emigration with an E, and this door here is very clearly marked, entrance for immigrants only. Now, what the heck does that mean? Immigrants coming in rather than going out? Americans in the 1850s at least, and for years before that, chose to see everyone entering through that door as an immigrant who was going west, even though, in fact, the vast majority who entered through the door at Ellis Island did not go west. Furthermore, Americans used the exact same word, immigrant, for American citizens who went west. So you could be a native-born immigrant, or you could be a foreign-born immigrant, but the emphasis was on leaving and moving along and going out from the civilized part of the world and bringing civilization out to the western frontier. Does that mean, however, that there were no immigrants, with an I, in the 1850s? In the West, the Chinese were always called immigrants, not immigrants. And in the East, many Irish and almost all Italians, although Czechs and others, were always called immigrants. They were workers, not settlers. Immigrant, in other words, was a pejorative term, and only much later does it become a positive term and the foundation for what we think of today as the nation of immigrants. And there's a whole long and interesting story that could be told there, but this isn't the time or place for it. Now, an image like this one, and the recognition that the very meaning of the word immigrant has changed over time, is a useful one, I think, because it forces us to acknowledge that while many people move around in American history and in human history generally, Americans have never considered all people on the move to be immigrants. The Ojibwa, who annually shifts her home place from fishing camp to hunting camp, from cornfield to rice harvest. This is a pattern of mobility in the upper Midwest, to some degree down to the present. Were they immigrants? No, they were never considered immigrants. The slave, the runaway slave? No. The Native American forced on the so-called Trail of Tears, clearly mobility, not an immigrant. The Pilgrims, or even the first Europeans in Jamestown, not immigrants. The draft resistor of the 1970s who's heading over into Canada, nope. The Yankee, like me, who relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina because I was just dying to be David's colleague, not an immigrant. The African American moving to Kansas in the 1870s, we could go on forever. But as these questions suggest, I think that a dialogue that begins with movement will be a more inclusive dialogue than one that focuses exclusively on immigration and you are, you aren't, you are, you aren't. It will also, I think, help us to focus on why some people, but not others, are labeled positively or negatively as immigrants. In thinking about these issues, it is very helpful to recognize and to begin to talk about the fact that people generally have very good reasons or motives for moving, and that while the motives for moving may be quite diverse, actually Americans and immigrants share most of the same motives when they decide to pick up and move themselves from one place to another. Ask your museum visitors. I regularly ask my students in classes, what does the pursuit of happiness mean? And in almost all cases, you will elicit stories of movement, not always immigration, but of movements. And usually discussions of movement that focus very much on people's motives for making a change. believe, rightly or wrongly, that a dialogue focused quite explicitly on why people move, based on their own personal experiences with moving around, usually will reveal 4 common motives for moving that are shared, whether you're Easterners or Westerners, Northerners or Southerners, foreigners or citizens. 4 motives will emerge as you share stories of your own movement. One motive is the shared desire to improve material conditions, either for yourself or for your family. Immigrants and Americans alike move to have a better job, a better house, better education, better economic opportunities. The list could continue, but we don't need to do it. Horrifically, one of the major causes of illegality in the United States today is the basic fact that the United States offers somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 visas a year for people wanting to work in agriculture, construction, the hospitality industry, major industries in the United States that hire millions upon millions of people for which no visas are available. Mismatch. We're still talking about that. Whether anything ever gets done about it remains to be seen. A second motive for moving, and it is a very powerful one, is the desire to be with the people you love, the people you marry, and to form communities of people who are your own kind, culturally and emotionally. 2/3 of all immigrants who come to the United States today enter with visas to reunify their families, or because they've married an American holder of a green card or citizenship. And with naturalization, you then invite your loved ones. And that process of moving around to be with the people you love is not an immigrant thing. I moved to Michigan to be with somebody I loved. I've moved to Germany to be with somebody I loved and married. This desire to follow or to be with or to reunify, even with siblings, is not an unusual one for Americans. A third motive for moving, shared again by Americans and foreigners alike, is a desire for freedom or liberty. That motive, figures very prominently in histories of the African American Great Migration, in the lives of refugees who flee discrimination and political oppression, and even actually in the story of youthful adventurers who think of movement as itself an exciting expression of freedom. I once asked my students, when do you feel most free? And they, I'm not kidding, they told me, when I'm driving around in my car. A fourth motive for moving, less lighthearted but equally important, Americans and foreigners alike preserve their own safety, and they seek safety by moving. You do not have to think too hard to realize that Americans, as well as Asian or African refugees, have fled from warfare. They have fled from places they associate with or where they have personally experienced criminality or political violence, and they have fled from environmental catastrophes, such as Hurricane Sandy or the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Now, to build trust, I argue, you must establish common ground. And shared motives for movement will allow you to do that, but they will also and simultaneously generate very tough questions about human rights and movement. Is the freedom to move a human right? Should it be considered a human right? As an historian, at the moment, I'm actually quite personally interested in that issue, and I circulated this short 15-page document written for American history teachers to explore the freedom to move as a theme in American history. Here's one of my favorite documents from that ongoing project. It almost always provokes an interesting discussion about movement as a form of freedom. It's the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. Many of you will know it as a key document in the anti-Chinese movement and the origins of immigration restriction in the US. I love the language of the Burlingame Treaty. It points very clearly to what it says here, the inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiances. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, the United States actively pursued a diplomatic strategy of signing bilateral treaties like this one with countries in Europe and Latin America, the purpose of which was to guarantee the freedom to move as a human right and to change or to naturalize as part of it. In 1868, the Burlingame Treaty offered that same freedom to the Chinese, and it summed up that freedom in this amazing phrase. That phrase acknowledges the many motives that drives human pursuit of happiness. It also acknowledges, critically important, I think, to our dialogues, that democratic governance emerges from a social contract and from the consent of the governed, and it also reveals how changing one's allegiance through the process of naturalization is a potent symbol of democracy. Thinking about the context in which this document was written introduces, I think, a new way of thinking about US history, a history which focuses not exclusively on immigration, but on a fundamental conflict, and this was Sarah's aha movement, between Americans' commitment to personal and individual freedom, including the freedom to move, and the freedom to stay, if that's where your happiness lies, and a very disturbing history of repeated and powerful restrictions imposed on that freedom. As this last slide suggests, what was slavery? What was Jim Crow? What was the American Indian Reservation, if not the removal of the inalienable right of man to choose his home and allegiance? What is immigration restriction, if not the removal of that right? And as I've looked at this problem of US history, and as I've talked about it with public audiences, I've had the experience of literally having someone in the audience say to me, oh, where restrictions on the freedom to move is from restrictions on Americans of color to restrictions on foreigners. That, I believe, that is the dialogue that we need to begin and that we need to continue to have about immigration today. Thank you.